when shelter beneath an ancient oak tree became their last hope against a frozen February night. They never imagined the gnarled roots hiding beneath their heads held a secret worth $260 million. A secret that powerful men had killed for, governments had hunted for decades, and one that would transform two forgotten souls into the most unlikely heroes their dying town had ever known. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind off the Cumberland Mountains didn't just bite that February evening, it tore through clothes like they were made of paper, turning breath into ice crystals before it left your lips. Martha Hayes pulled her threadbare coat tighter as she and her husband Roy huddled on the bench outside the Maple Ridge Public Library, watching the last of the staff lock up for the night. The librarian, a young woman named Sophie, paused at the door, her eyes filled with the kind of pity that made Martha's chest ache worse than the cold. "Mrs. Hayes," Sophie said softly, "the warming shelter on 5th Street still has space. I called them. They're expecting you." Martha forced a smile, the kind that had gotten her through 73 years of life, through raising 4 children, through losing 2 of them, through watching her husband's auto repair shop close after 40 years, through the hospital bills that swallowed their home. "We'll be fine, dear. Roy's cousin has a place just a few miles up the road. We're heading there now." It was a lie, gentle and necessary. Roy's cousin had stopped returning their calls 6 months ago. But Martha couldn't bear another night in the shelter, couldn't stand the fluorescent lights that never dimmed, the coughs echoing off cinder block walls, the look in Roy's eyes that said he'd failed her, failed them, failed everything he'd spent a lifetime building. Roy stood slowly, his 76-year-old knees protesting, the arthritis that had ended his mechanic days now making every movement a negotiation with pain. He took Martha's hand, the same hand he'd held on their wedding day 54 years ago, the hand that had packed school lunches and bandaged scraped knees and held his face when the bank took their house. "Come on, Marth," he said quietly. "We'll figure it out." They walked through downtown Maple Ridge as businesses shuttered and streetlights flickered on. The town looked tired, worn down by the same economic collapse that had hollowed out so many small communities. Empty storefronts lined Main Street. The old courthouse needed paint. The factory that once employed 800 people sat dark and silent behind a chain-link fence. Martha and Roy had watched it all crumble, year by year, job by job, until even their modest retirement had been devoured by Roy's heart surgery and Martha's diabetes medication. Social Security checks that once covered rent and groceries now barely paid for prescriptions. The children who'd moved away to find work sent what they could, but everyone was drowning in their own way. The eviction notice had come 3 weeks ago. Not because they were bad tenants. They'd lived in that little rental house for 7 years, never late on rent until the hospital bills started coming. But the landlord needed to sell, needed cash fast, and a house with paying tenants was worth less than an empty one. They'd been given 30 days. It felt like 30 seconds. Martha remembered the day they loaded their belongings into a storage unit they couldn't afford, paying for 3 months up front with money scraped from the bottom of every drawer, every coat pocket, every forgotten envelope. Furniture that had traveled with them through 5 decades of marriage, photograph albums documenting a life well lived, Roy's toolbox from his first day as a mechanic, Martha's mother's wedding china, all of it sealed behind a rolling metal door with a padlock that felt like a coffin closing. They'd spent the first week sleeping in their ancient Ford pickup, parked in different spots each night to avoid attention. But the cold was brutal that year, and sleeping sitting up in a truck cab left them so stiff and aching they could barely move come morning. The warming shelter became their reluctant refuge, but each night there felt like another small death, another admission that they'd somehow failed at the basic human task of keeping a roof overhead. Roy had been a good mechanic. No, he'd been a great mechanic, the kind who could diagnose an engine problem just by listening, who worked honest and fair, who built a reputation over decades. But when the economy collapsed and people started driving their cars until they literally fell apart, then buying used instead of fixing, his small shop couldn't compete. The big chain repair places with their coupons and credit plans ate up what little business remained. He'd held on for 3 years past when he should have closed, burning through their savings, mortgaging their house, believing that hard work and integrity would eventually be rewarded. They weren't. The shop closed on a Tuesday morning in October. Roy locked the door for the last time, placed the key in the realtor's hand, and didn't speak for the rest of the day. Martha had worked too, 30 years as a home health aide, bathing elderly clients, administering medications, providing the kind of care that required both skill and heart. But her back had given out at 68, 3 herniated discs that made lifting impossible. The disability payments were a fraction of her salary, and they came too late to save the house they'd already mortgaged to keep Roy's business alive. Medical debt was the final nail. Roy's heart attack at 73 required bypass surgery, 5 hours under the knife, 2 weeks in the hospital, 3 months of recovery. Even with Medicare, the bills were staggering. Martha's diabetes had progressed despite her best efforts, requiring insulin that cost $300 a month even with insurance. They'd tried every program, every assistance option, every charity. But the math was simple and brutal. Their income couldn't cover their costs. Something had to give. That something was their home, then their car, sold to pay the storage unit and buy 6 more months of medication. Then their dignity, piece by piece, night by night, as they became the elderly couple on the bench, the ones people looked at with pity or looked past entirely. By the time they reached the edge of town that frozen February evening, the sun had set completely. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees, and the weather forecast called for 12 more degrees lower by midnight. Martha's fingers were numb despite her gloves, the cheap kind from the dollar store with holes in 3 fingers. Roy's breath came in short, labored puffs, his heart medication making him tire easily. "There," Roy said, pointing toward a stand of trees just off the old highway. "We can get out of the wind at least." The forest was dense with oak, maple, and pine, the underbrush thick enough to provide some shelter from the cutting wind. They pushed through dormant brambles and frozen leaves, moving deeper into the woods. Martha's teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting copper. Each step felt like walking through cement, her joints screaming, her feet numb in her worn sneakers that had holes in both soles. She thought about warm beds, about Sunday mornings waking slowly, Roy's arm around her waist, sunlight streaming through curtains in a house that was theirs, about the smell of coffee brewing and bacon frying, about grandchildren visiting for holidays, about a life that felt impossibly distant now, like a dream she'd once had and could barely remember. "Martha, look!" She lifted her head. Through the darkness, illuminated by a sliver of moon, stood the most magnificent oak tree Martha had ever seen. It was ancient, easily 10 feet in diameter, its massive trunk gnarled and twisted like the hands of 100 grandfathers. The bark was deeply furrowed, and several of the lower branches were thick as telephone poles, reaching out like protective arms. But what caught their attention was the base. Centuries of growth had created a hollow space between the sprawling roots, an almost cave-like shelter where the tree's massive root system had grown up and over itself, creating an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. "It's like a room," Martha whispered, her voice thin with cold and wonder. They approached carefully, Roy shining the small keychain flashlight he kept in his pocket. The weak beam revealed more than they'd dared hope. The space between the roots was larger than it appeared from outside, big enough for both of them to crawl inside, maybe 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide. The ground was covered in old leaves and dirt, but it was dry, protected from above by the interwoven roots and from the sides by the thick trunk. "What do you think?" Roy asked, though Martha could hear the hope already creeping into his voice. She looked back toward town, toward the shelter with its rules and schedules and the shame that came with signing in each night, with admitting to strangers that you had nowhere else to go. Then she looked at the oak tree, at this impossible shelter that nature had somehow prepared for them, at a space that was private and protected and somehow felt more like home than anywhere they'd been in 3 weeks. "I think God works in mysterious ways," she said softly. They moved quickly now, driven by cold and necessity. Roy gathered fallen branches while Martha collected armfuls of pine boughs from nearby evergreens, their needles still green and fragrant. They worked in practiced silence, the kind of cooperation that comes from 54 years of marriage, anticipating each other's movements, supporting without needing to ask. Inside the root hollow, they created a makeshift bed with the pine boughs, layering them to provide both cushioning and insulation from the frozen ground. Roy had a plastic tarp in his backpack, the one he'd been carrying since they lost the house, always prepared for the next indignity, the next emergency. It was only 6 feet by 8 feet, but they stretched it across the opening of the hollow, securing the corners with rocks and branches, creating a barrier against the wind that was already picking up as the storm moved in. The space felt almost cozy once they were inside, sealed away from the brutal night. Their body heat began to warm the small area, and the tarp blocked enough wind that Martha's teeth finally stopped chattering. They huddled together in the darkness, Roy's arms around Martha, her head on his shoulder, breathing in sync. "Remember when we took the kids camping at Cumberland Falls?" Martha asked softly, her voice muffled against Roy's jacket. Roy chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Jimmy fell in the creek trying to catch that salamander, came back looking like a drowned rat, crying that the salamander got away. And Sarah ate so many s'mores she got sick in the tent," Martha added. "Spent half the night outside, swearing she'd never eat chocolate again." "She broke that promise about 12 hours later," Roy said, and they both smiled in the darkness. They traded memories like currency, the only wealth they had left. Their first apartment with the leaky faucet and the neighbors who fought every Saturday night. The day Roy proposed, getting down on one knee in the parking lot of the diner where Martha worked, the ring hidden in a box from the hardware store because he couldn't afford a fancy one. Their wedding, small and simple in Martha's parents' backyard with folding chairs and homemade cake and so much love it made the air feel thick. The births of their children, Thomas first, then Sarah, then Michael, then Jennifer. 4 lives they'd brought into the world and raised with everything they had. The sleepless nights and sick days and school plays and baseball games, the fights over homework and curfews and borrowed cars, the graduations and weddings and grandchildren who came with sticky hands and endless questions. "We had a good life," Martha said quietly, though it came out like a question. "We had a great life," Roy corrected firmly. "We're still having one. This doesn't erase everything that came before." "Doesn't it? I mean, what does it say about us that we ended up here, 2 old people hiding in a tree like children?" Roy was quiet for a moment, his arms tightening around her. "It says we survived. It says when life pushed us down, we got back up and kept walking. It says we didn't give up, even when giving up would have been easier." Martha wanted to believe him, but she also felt the weight of their situation pressing down like the cold itself, relentless and suffocating. They'd done everything right, worked hard, saved money, raised their kids to be good people, paid their taxes, volunteered at church, helped their neighbors, and still they'd ended up here, homeless and forgotten, 2 more casualties of an economy that chewed up people their age and spit them out. Outside, the wind howled through the trees with a sound like mourning. The temperature continued to drop, but inside their hollow, pressed against each other for warmth, they were safe enough, together enough. Martha shifted, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard ground beneath the layer of pine boughs. Her hip protested, arthritis flaring, and she reached down to adjust the boughs beneath her. Her hand scraped against something that didn't feel like dirt or root or rock. It was too smooth, too regular, almost metallic. "Roy," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "Shine your light here." He fumbled for the flashlight, his fingers stiff with cold. The weak beam illuminated where Martha's hand had been. She brushed away pine needles and old leaves, revealing something that made no sense in the floor of a natural tree hollow. Metal, dark and pitted with age, but unmistakably manufactured. "What in the world?" Roy muttered, leaning closer. They both started digging now, hands working in the cold soil, uncovering more of whatever lay beneath. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a surface, flat and wide, stretching beyond the light of their tiny flashlight. The metal was clearly very old, maybe a century or more, but it had been protected by the tree's roots, by the dry environment within the hollow. Martha's heart began to pound for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. "Roy, this isn't natural. This is man-made." He didn't answer, just kept digging, his movements more urgent now despite his aching joints. The metal was rough with rust in places but surprisingly intact in others, suggesting it had been sealed away somehow, protected from the worst of the elements. As they cleared more dirt, working by feel as much as sight, a shape began to emerge. A door. They'd found a door. It was roughly 3 feet square, set into what appeared to be concrete, though that too was ancient and crumbling at the edges. Heavy rivets held it in place, the kind you'd see on old industrial equipment or, Martha's breath caught, on a vault. Roy sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his hand pressed to his chest. Martha immediately reached for him, worried about his heart, about pushing him too far. "Roy, stop! We can leave it. It's probably nothing." "It's not nothing," he said, but his voice was shaky. He fumbled in his jacket for his medication, took a pill dry, winced as it went down. "Just give me a minute." They sat in silence for a long moment, staring at what they'd uncovered. In the center of the metal door, barely visible under decades of accumulated grime and rust, was a circular handle, like a ship's wheel but smaller, maybe 8 inches in diameter. "Martha," Roy finally said, his voice steadier now. "We need to think about this." "Think about what?" "Whatever this is, it's been hidden a long time. Buried, sealed, forgotten. There's a reason for that." Martha knew he was right. Her practical mind, the one that had navigated 73 years of life with caution and common sense, was screaming warnings. This could be anything. An old septic system, a forgotten well, a bootlegger's cache from Prohibition days. It could be dangerous. It could be nothing. It could be trouble they definitely didn't need. But another part of her, the part that had spent 3 weeks sleeping in shelters and cars, the part that had watched their entire life's accumulation disappear piece by piece, the part that had nothing left to lose, that part whispered, "Open it." "We're sleeping on top of it," she said finally. "I'd rather know what it is than wonder all night. Besides," she added with a grim smile, "at our age, how much trouble can we really get into?" Roy looked at his wife's face in the dim light, saw the steel beneath the exhaustion, and loved her even more than he had 54 years ago. "All right, but careful now." He gripped the circular handle, his mechanic's hands finding purchase despite the rust. He pulled. Nothing. Decades of rust and soil had sealed it shut. He tried again, putting his weight into it, and Martha heard something in his chest pop, the sound of an old man pushing his body past its limits. "Roy, stop. You'll hurt yourself." "I'm fine," he insisted, though they both knew he wasn't. Nothing about any of this was fine. But he pulled again, this time twisting as he pulled, and something gave. A crack, a shower of rust, and the handle turned a 1/4 inch. "Together," Martha said, moving to grip the handle beside him. "On 3. 1, 2. They pulled as one, their combined weight and strength finally breaking whatever seal had held the door closed for decades. The handle turned with a grinding shriek that made them both freeze, worried about discovery, about someone hearing. But the forest was empty, the storm covering all sounds, and after a moment they continued. The door released with a hiss, like a gasp after holding breath too long. Stale air rushed out, decades old, carrying the scent of machine oil and something else Martha couldn't quite place. Paper, maybe, or old leather. The smell of time itself, of things preserved and forgotten. The door swung inward, revealing darkness below, absolute and deep. Roy shined his flashlight into the opening. Stone steps led down into what appeared to be a chamber, the walls lined with something that reflected the light, tile maybe, or polished stone. The steps were steep but intact, each one carefully cut, not natural at all. "There's a whole room down there," Roy whispered, his voice filled with wonder and fear. Martha's practical side warred with her curiosity. They were two elderly people, alone in the woods at night, about to climb into an unknown underground space that had been sealed for God knew how long. Every instinct screamed danger. They should close it back up, cover it over, forget they'd ever found it. They should be cautious, sensible, safe. But safety hadn't protected them from losing everything. Caution hadn't kept the bank from taking their house. Sensibility hadn't stopped the hospital from sending bills they couldn't pay. All their careful, practical living had led them here, to a hollow in a tree on the coldest night of the year. What did they have left to protect by being careful? What was left to lose? "Together?" Martha asked. Roy squeezed her hand, his grip still strong despite everything. "Always." They descended slowly, Roy going first, testing each stone step before putting his full weight on it. The chamber opened up around them as they went deeper, the flashlight beam dancing across walls that were definitely tiled. White subway tiles, like you'd find in an old bathroom or kitchen from the 1920s or 30s. But these were pristine, protected from the elements by whatever seal had kept this place dry for nearly a century. The air was cold but not frozen, dry but not dusty, as if the space had been hermetically sealed. Their footsteps echoed off the walls, making Martha acutely aware of how far underground they were going. 5 steps, 8 steps, 12 steps. At the bottom, maybe 12 feet below ground level, they found themselves in a room about the size of a small bedroom. The ceiling was arched stone, the floor smooth concrete. And it wasn't empty. Metal shelves lined 3 walls, industrial shelving that looked military in its efficiency and precision. And on those shelves sat rows of wooden crates, dozens of them. Some were small, shoebox-sized. Others were larger, nearly 3 feet on each side. All of them were sealed with rusted metal straps and marked with stenciled numbers that had faded but were still partially visible. In the center of the room sat a desk, old oak by the look of it, solid and heavy. And on that desk, illuminated now by Roy's trembling flashlight, was a leather journal, somehow preserved despite the decades, and next to it, a single piece of paper under a glass weight. Martha moved toward it as if pulled by invisible strings. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the glass weight and lifted the paper. It was yellowed but legible, the handwriting careful and precise, written in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "To whoever finds this, you have either earned it through cleverness or been blessed by fortune. Either way, it's yours now. Use it better than we did. C.H. May 1928. Roy picked up the journal with hands that wouldn't stay steady. Inside, the pages were filled with numbers, dates, names. Columns of figures marched down each page in that same careful script. He flipped to the first page, tilted it toward the light, and read, "Final Accounting, Cedar Hills Operation." Below that, line after line of entries. Federal Reserve notes relocated from Chicago Depot, 50,000. Gold certificates secured from Kansas City operation, 80,000. Bearer bonds, various denominations, 120,000. The amounts made Martha dizzy. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "Roy, these numbers—" "I know," he said, his voice hollow. "These are 1920s dollars. But Martha, look at this." He pointed to a total at the bottom of the page, underlined 3 times. Total value, all assets, $8,300,000. They stared at the number, at the impossible figure written in fading ink nearly a century ago. Then, moving as one, they turned to look at the crates lining the walls. "We have to open one," Martha heard herself say, though the voice didn't sound like hers. "We have to know if this is real or if we're losing our minds." There was a hammer on the desk. Somehow there was a hammer, like it had been left there for exactly this purpose. Roy picked it up, tested its weight, then moved to the nearest crate. It was medium-sized, marked with the stencil CH0127 and dated June 1927. He pried at the metal straps. The wood was old, brittle. It gave way easily, splinters flying. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crackled when Martha touched it, were stacks of paper bound with rotted rubber bands. Martha lifted one stack carefully, afraid it might disintegrate in her hands. But the oilcloth had done its job. The paper inside was pristine, crisp, as if it had been printed yesterday. It wasn't paper. It was money. $100 bills. A whole stack of them, maybe 100 bills total. And beneath that stack, another. And another. The entire crate was filled with bundled currency, each bill marked with denominations and designs Martha had only seen in history books. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Roy, oh my God." But Roy was already opening another crate, his movements jerky with shock or hope or fear. Martha couldn't tell which. This one held something that gleamed even in the weak flashlight beam. Gold coins, hundreds of them, each one stamped with dates from the 1920s. And beneath them, certificates of some kind, heavy paper with ornate borders and official seals. They opened crate after crate, moving faster now, unable to stop themselves. Cash in denominations Martha didn't know still existed. $500 bills, $1,000 bills, each one crisp and perfect. Gold coins and bars, heavy and real and worth. Martha couldn't even calculate. Bearer bonds, the journal had called them, each one marked with amounts that made her vision blur. "Stop," Roy finally said, his voice cracking. "Martha, stop. We have to stop and think." But Martha was reading the journal now, turning pages with shaking hands, piecing together a story from the cryptic entries. The handwriting changed partway through. C.H. had apparently died or stopped writing, and someone else, signed only as R., had continued the accounting. The entries chronicled what could only be criminal enterprise: prohibition smuggling, numbers running, protection rackets, theft. 5 years of organized crime, documented in careful script. The last entry was dated June 11, 1933. Martha read it aloud, her voice shaking. "Final deposit complete. Federal investigation closing in. Chicago connections compromised. This cash represents 5 years of work. Prohibition, numbers, transport operations. Total estimated value, $8.3 million. The tree continues to grow over the entrance. In another year, no one will ever know this place exists. We're going underground, west to California. If any of us survive, we'll return. If not, may this do more good lost than it did in our hands." Silence filled the underground chamber, heavy and profound. Martha looked up at Roy, saw her own shock and disbelief and impossible hope reflected in his eyes. "Roy," she whispered, "they never came back." "No," he agreed quietly. "They didn't." They sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by a fortune that had been hidden for 95 years, a fortune that represented pain and crime and blood, now transmuted by time into simple opportunity. Above them, the ancient oak tree's roots reached down like fingers, and beyond that, a February storm raged through the Tennessee night. And in that moment, Martha Hayes and Roy Hayes, 73 and 76 years old, homeless and forgotten by the world, realized they'd found something that would change everything or destroy them trying. "What do we do?" Martha finally asked, her voice small in the underground darkness. Roy looked at the crates, at the journal, at his wife of 54 years. "I don't know, Martha," he said honestly. but we need to be very, very careful about what happens next." They didn't sleep that night. How could they? Beneath the floorboards of their makeshift shelter lay a secret that defied comprehension, and above them a winter storm howled with increasing fury, as if the universe itself was demanding an answer to the question that hung in the frozen air. What now? Martha sat with her back against the gnarled oak root, the journal open in her lap, reading entries by the pale beam of Roy's dying flashlight. Each page revealed another piece of a puzzle nearly a century old: names of speakeasies in Chicago, dates of liquor shipments, payoffs to police captains and city aldermen. The clinical precision of the accounting made the crimes somehow more chilling. These weren't desperate acts. They were a business. "Listen to this," she said, her finger tracing a line dated March 1929. "Received shipment from Detroit Connection. 40 cases Canadian whiskey, distributed through usual channels. Gross, $12,000. Expenses, $2,800. Net deposited to cash, $9,200. Roy shifted beside her, his breath visible in the cold despite their tarp shelter. They were using this place as a bank, somewhere the feds couldn't trace, couldn't raid. "But why leave it?" Martha asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since they'd read that final entry. "If you have $8 million hidden away, why abandon it? Why not come back?" "Maybe they couldn't," Roy said quietly. "The entry said federal investigation. Maybe they got caught. Or killed. Gangsters didn't exactly retire peacefully in those days." Martha turned more pages, noting how the handwriting grew increasingly hasty toward the end, the neat columns giving way to hurried scrawls. Someone had been scared. Someone had been running out of time. The last few entries weren't dated by day, just marked final week with increasingly desperate notations. Indianapolis connection compromised, Milwaukee operation shut down, Chicago heat increasing, time to disappear. "They were being hunted," Martha murmured, "and they knew they might never make it back." She closed the journal and looked at the sealed vault door they'd only partially explored, at the stone steps disappearing into darkness below. They'd opened 3 crates, just 3, and already they'd seen more money than she'd earned in her entire working life. But the room had been full of crates, dozens of them, and if each one held even a fraction of what those first 3 contained. "We have to go back down," she said, though every rational instinct screamed against it. "We have to know what's really there." Roy didn't argue. He'd been thinking the same thing. They'd crossed a line the moment they'd opened that door. You couldn't unsee what they'd seen, unknow what they knew. The only path now was forward. They waited until first light, until the storm had passed and a gray dawn filtered through the bare branches. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, 7 degrees by Roy's estimate. But inside their shelter, wrapped in each other's arms and the secret they now shared, they'd stayed warm enough to survive. When they descended the stone steps again, the underground chamber felt different somehow. Less threatening, more familiar. Or maybe they were just becoming accustomed to the impossible. Roy's flashlight beam, weaker now, batteries dying, swept across the rows of crates, and Martha's breath caught. In daylight filtering weakly through the open vault door, she could see what they'd missed in the darkness. There were more shelves than they'd initially realized, extending back into alcoves carved into the stone. And in the far corner, partially hidden behind a support beam, sat something larger. A safe, old-fashioned and massive, the kind you'd need 3 men to move. "Roy," she whispered, pointing. They approached it carefully, as if it might vanish if they moved too quickly. The safe was black steel, at least 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with a combination dial on the front and a manufacturer's plate that read Herring Hall, Marvin, New York, patent 1922. Roy ran his hand over the surface, feeling the cold metal, the absolute solidity of it. "This alone probably weighs 1,000 pounds, he said. "They must have brought it down in pieces and assembled it here." "Can we open it?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. Without the combination, they had no chance. The thing was built to withstand dynamite. But Roy was examining the door, his mechanic's eyes catching something Martha had missed. "Look," he said, pointing to a small piece of paper wedged between the safe door and its frame. "Looks like someone left a note." He worked it free carefully, unfolding paper that crackled with age. Inside, in that same precise handwriting from the journal, was a series of numbers, 37-12-44-8. "The combination," Martha breathed. "They left the combination." "Why would they do that?" Roy asked, but even as he spoke he was already turning the dial. "Unless they knew they weren't coming back. Unless this was always meant to be found someday." The dial clicked softly as Roy worked through the numbers. 37 right, 12 left, 44 right, 8 left. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a solid thunk that echoed through the chamber, the lock disengaged. Roy gripped the handle and pulled. The door swung open on hinges that, despite nearly a century of disuse, moved smoothly, evidence of quality engineering and the perfectly dry environment that had preserved everything down here. Inside, the safe held things more valuable than money, at least in terms of understanding what they'd found. Leather document folders, each one labeled and organized. Martha pulled out the first one, opened it with trembling hands. Inside were incorporation papers, property deeds, stock certificates. But these weren't legitimate businesses. The notes scrawled in margins made that clear. Front for import operation, used for storage and distribution. Another deed was marked, secondary location, abandoned after raid June 27th. "They documented everything," Martha said, awe and horror mixing in her voice. "Every property, every business, every crime. Why would they keep such detailed records?" Roy was examining another folder, this one filled with photographs. Men in suits standing in front of speakeasies, trucks loaded with crates, even a few shots of what looked like police raids captured from a distance. "Insurance," he said. "If they ever got caught, maybe they planned to use this to bargain. Give up other operations in exchange for lighter sentences." But the most chilling folder was labeled simply depositors. Inside, a ledger listed names, dozens of them, with amounts beside each. Capone, A. Deposit March 28, 50,000. Luciano, C. Deposit July 28, 35,000. Lansky, M. Deposit December 28, 75,000. Martha's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the folder. These weren't just local criminals. These were names she recognized from history books, from documentaries about organized crime. This cash wasn't just one gang's fortune. It was a clearinghouse for multiple operations, a Swiss bank for American gangsters. "Roy," she whispered, "this isn't $8 million. He looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. The original deposit was $8 million, but if other operations were using it too, if they were adding to it. They moved through the chamber with new urgency now, opening crates they'd left sealed the night before. More cash, stacks and stacks of it, in denominations Martha didn't even know existed. $500 bills, $1,000 bills, even a few $10,000 bills, each one crisp and perfect, preserved by the oilcloth and the dry air. Gold, not just coins now, but bars, dozens of them, each one stamped with weight and purity marks, each one worth a fortune by itself. Martha tried to count them but lost track after 50. There had to be hundreds of pounds of gold down here, and the bearer bonds. These were what made Martha's knees weak. Bearer bonds were as good as cash, payable to whoever held them. They'd been popular in the 20s and 30s because they were anonymous, untraceable. Perfect for criminals. But they were also often issued by legitimate corporations and governments. She found bonds from General Motors, from U.S. Steel, from the New York Central Railroad. Bonds issued by the U.S. Treasury itself, war bonds from World War I that might still be redeemable. Each one worth thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, and there were hundreds of them, carefully sorted and wrapped in wax paper, organized by issue date and maturity. "We need to estimate," Roy said, his voice tight. "We need to know what we're dealing with." They worked for hours, Martha keeping tally in the back of the journal, while Roy examined and counted. The cash alone, accounting for the fact that much of it was in denominations no longer in circulation, but worth far more to collectors, probably totaled $60 to $70 million. The gold, at current market prices, Roy remembered from a news report he'd heard months ago, had to be worth at least $150 million. And the bearer bonds, if even half of them were still redeemable, could add another $40 to $50 million. By the time they finished counting, the weak morning light was fading toward afternoon. Martha stared at the number she'd written at the bottom of the page, at the figure that seemed more like a phone number than a dollar amount. $260 million, she said, her voice hollow. "Give or take. Roy, we're sitting on $260 million. The number hung in the air between them, too large to comprehend, too impossible to accept. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the discovery pressing down like the earth above them. "We're dead," Roy finally said. Martha looked at him sharply. "What?" "Think about it, Martha. This money, it belonged to the worst criminals in American history. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky. These men killed people for looking at them wrong. And even if they're long dead, their organizations might not be. Might still have people who remember this cash, who've been looking for it all these years." "For 95 years, Martha countered, but her voice wavered. "How much is 95 years when you're talking about this kind of money? And that's not even the worst part." Roy stood, pacing the small chamber. "The government's been fighting organized crime since the 20s. You think the FBI just forgot about $250 million? There are probably files somewhere, cold cases, investigations that never closed. The moment we report this, and we have to report it, Martha, we can't not report it. We become the center of the biggest treasure recovery case in American history." Martha felt cold, despite the relatively warm underground air. She hadn't thought past the discovery, past the impossible fortune at their feet. But Roy was right. This wasn't like finding a bag of money on the street. This was evidence in crimes that might still be open, property that powerful interests might still claim. "What if we just took some?" she heard herself say, hating the words even as they left her mouth. "Just enough to get back on our feet, get a place to live, the rest we report. And when they investigate, and they will investigate, they'll know the cash was disturbed. They'll know some is missing. We'd go from finders to thieves, from heroes to criminals." Roy sat down heavily on the concrete floor. "There's no partial honesty here, Martha. It's all or nothing. What happens next will turn this discovery upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the hardest wealth to carry is the kind nobody knows you have. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Martha knew he was right, but the unfairness of it made her chest ache. For weeks they'd had nothing, had been nothing in the world's eyes. And now they had everything, or could have, and the same honesty that had defined their entire lives was demanding they give it away. "I want to be angry," she said quietly. "I want to rail at God or fate or whatever put us in this position. We've done everything right our whole lives, Roy. We worked hard. We paid our taxes. We raised good kids. We helped our neighbors. And we still lost everything. We ended up homeless. We almost froze to death. And now we find this, and you're telling me the right thing to do is give it away?" "Not give it away," Roy corrected gently. "Report it. Turn it over to the authorities. There's a difference. Finders keepers is real law, Martha. We might get a reward, a significant one. Or we might get nothing, Martha said bitterly. The government could seize it all, call it criminal proceeds, and we'd be right back where we started. Except now everyone would know about it. Every con artist and criminal would know our names. We'd never be safe again. They sat in the underground chamber as the afternoon light faded, surrounded by a fortune that felt more like a curse with each passing moment. The euphoria of discovery had evaporated, replaced by a bone-deep fear of what came next. "Tell me what you're thinking," Martha finally said. "Really thinking." Roy was quiet for a long time, his face lined and tired, looking every one of his 76 years. "I'm thinking about Bill Peterson." Martha nodded slowly. Everyone in Maple Ridge knew Bill's story. He'd found money, kept it, spent it, and paid for that decision with 7 years in federal prison and the destruction of his family. "But I'm also thinking," Roy continued, "about what this could mean, not just for us, but for people like us. How many nights did we spend at that shelter, Marth? How many elderly people did we see there, too proud to beg but too broke to survive? How many kids did we watch go hungry because their parents couldn't find work?" Roy Dash. "No, listen. What if this money, properly reported, properly handled, could actually help people? What if there's a finder's fee big enough to change our lives and still leave most of it to be used for good? What if we could turn something born from crime into something that heals?" Martha wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe. But 73 years of life had taught her that the world rarely worked the way it should. The rich got richer, the poor got pushed aside, and people like them, honest and hard-working, ended up sleeping in trees. "What if they take it all?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if we report it and get nothing and spend the rest of our lives knowing we had a chance and threw it away?" "Then at least we'll be able to sleep at night," Roy said. "And at least we won't spend whatever time we have left looking over our shoulders, waiting for the FBI or worse to come knocking." Martha looked around the chamber one more time, at the crates of cash and gold, at the bearer bonds that could solve every problem they'd ever had, at the journal that documented crimes nearly a century old. She thought about the men who'd hidden this fortune, criminals who'd killed and stolen and destroyed lives. She thought about how they'd run, how they'd never made it back, how their ill-gotten gains had sat here untouched while the world above moved on. She thought about the note they'd left. "Use it better than we did." "We need to sleep on it," she said finally. "One night. We think about what this really means, what the consequences are, what we can live with. Tomorrow morning we decide." Roy nodded slowly. "One night. But Martha, we can't tell anyone yet. Not the kids, not anyone. Once word gets out, everything changes. We need to be absolutely certain before we take that step." They sealed the vault door as well as they could, replaced the dirt and leaves over it, made it look as undisturbed as possible. Then they climbed back into their shelter in the oak tree's roots and held each other as darkness fell for the second night. But this time, the darkness was different. This time, they weren't just two homeless elderly people trying to survive. They were the keepers of a secret that could change everything if it didn't destroy them first. As they lay in the cold, Martha let her mind drift back over the past year, over all the losses that had brought them to this moment. She remembered the day Roy closed his shop, how he'd sat in his truck in the empty parking lot for an hour, just staring at the building that had been his life's work. She remembered his hands on the steering wheel, knuckles white, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She remembered the hospital bills arriving day after day, each one a fresh wound. The medical coding made no sense. $20 for a single aspirin, $300 for a 5-minute consultation, $5,000 for a test that took 10 seconds. She'd called the billing department, tried to negotiate, tried to understand, but the numbers were the numbers, and the numbers said they owed more than they could ever pay. She remembered the meeting with the bank, how the loan officer, a kid who looked fresh out of college, had explained that their mortgage application was denied. Not because they were bad risks historically, but because at their age, with their income, with Roy's health issues, they were actuarially unfavorable. That was the phrase he'd used, actuarially unfavorable. Like their entire lives could be reduced to a spreadsheet that said they weren't worth the investment. She remembered packing up the house, loading boxes into the storage unit, leaving behind furniture they couldn't afford to move. The bed where they'd slept for 30 years, the kitchen table where they'd raised their children, the rocking chair where she'd nursed 4 babies and rocked 6 grandchildren, all of it abandoned because they couldn't figure out the mathematics of survival. She remembered the first night in the shelter, the shame burning in her throat like acid. The intake worker had been kind, so kind it made Martha want to cry, asking gentle questions about how they'd ended up there, what services they needed. Martha had answered in a monotone, feeling like she was describing someone else's life, because surely this couldn't be hers. She remembered Roy's face that night, how he wouldn't meet her eyes, how he'd apologized over and over until she'd had to tell him to stop because she couldn't bear it. It wasn't his fault. It was the economy, the healthcare system, the bad luck of aging in a world that had no use for people past their earning years. And now this impossible windfall that felt less like salvation and more like a test of their character, their principles, their very souls. What would we do with it? She whispered into the darkness. If we kept it, if we could keep it, what would we actually do? Roy's voice came back, soft and thoughtful. Get you that insulin pump your doctor wanted, the one insurance wouldn't cover. Make sure you never have to ration your medication again. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been rationing for 6 months, stretching her doses, skipping them sometimes when the numbers weren't too bad, trying to make the prescription last until they could afford the next one. She'd thought Roy hadn't noticed. Get my heart meds adjusted properly, Roy continued. See that specialist at the university hospital, the one who could maybe do something about these chest pains. They were quiet for a moment. Then Martha said, Help the kids. Thomas is 3 months behind on his mortgage. Sarah's youngest needs braces. Michael's car died and he's been taking the bus to work. And Jennifer, Roy added, her husband left her with all that credit card debt. She's working 2 jobs and barely keeping her head above water. They could do all that with $260 million. They could solve every problem their family had. They could buy houses for their children, set up college funds for their grandchildren, create a cushion of security that would last generations. But they could also buy houses for other people's children, fund other people's medical care, create security for families they'd never meet but who were struggling just like they'd struggled. The shelter, Martha said suddenly. We could fund it, make sure it never closes, make sure it's warm and safe and treats people like human beings. We could start our own shelter, Roy said, his voice growing stronger. A better one, where people have privacy and dignity, where they can get real help, not just a cot for the night. We could fund scholarships for kids from families like ours, kids who are smart and hardworking but can't afford college. We could set up a fund for medical debt relief, help people drowning in bills they'll never be able to pay. They were building dreams now, painting pictures of what good could come from this tainted money. And with each dream, Martha felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the grip that fear and anger had on her heart. Maybe this was what the original owner had meant when he wrote, "Use it better than we did." Maybe money stolen and hidden could be redeemed through how it was ultimately used. Maybe crimes nearly a century old could finally do some good in the world. But first, they had to survive the claiming of it. First, they had to navigate a legal and bureaucratic maze that could easily swallow them whole. "I'm scared," Martha admitted. "I'm more scared now than when we were sleeping in the truck, because then we had nothing to lose. Now we have everything to lose." Roy pulled her closer. "Then we'll be scared together. But Marth, we've faced worse than this." "Have we?" We raised 4 kids on 2 blue-collar salaries. We survived losing James and Emily. We survived your back injury and my heart attack. We survived losing everything we'd built over 50 years. And we're still here, still together, still us. He kissed the top of her head. We'll survive this too, whatever comes. Martha wanted to believe him. She held on to him in the darkness, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest, and tried to draw strength from the fact that they'd weathered every storm so far. But this felt different. This felt like the kind of storm that didn't just test you, it transformed you. And there was no way to know if you'd recognize yourself when it passed. Above them, through the gaps in the tarp and roots, stars emerged in a clear sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind air so cold and clean it hurt to breathe. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, the sound sharp and lonely. And beneath their backs, through 12 feet of earth and stone, sat a fortune that had been hidden for 95 years, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to claim it, waiting to see if the couple who'd discovered it would prove worthy of the trust placed in them by a long-dead criminal who'd asked only that they use it better than he had. Martha didn't sleep that night either. Instead, she prayed, something she hadn't done much of lately, too angry at a God who'd let them fall so far. But tonight, with everything hanging in the balance, she found herself whispering into the darkness, "Show us the right path. Give us wisdom. Protect us from our own greed and fear. And please, please let us come through this still being the people we've always tried to be." Roy's breathing eventually evened out into sleep, exhaustion finally claiming him. But Martha stayed awake, watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about choices and consequences, about roads taken and not taken, about how a single moment could split your life into before and after. Tomorrow they would decide. Tomorrow they would set in motion events that couldn't be undone. Tomorrow they would step out of the shadows of the oak tree and into a light that might illuminate or incinerate them. But tonight they were still just Martha and Roy Hayes, 2 elderly people who'd lost everything and found something impossible. 2 people at a crossroads that would define not just the rest of their lives, but their very souls. The question was, which path would they choose, and would they recognize themselves on the other side? Dawn broke cold and clear over the Tennessee hills, the kind of morning where the light seems to cut through everything, leaving no shadows, no hiding places. Martha woke with her decision already made, as if her subconscious had worked through the night while her conscious mind wrestled with fear. She knew what they had to do. The knowing sat in her chest like a stone, heavy, solid, unmovable. Roy was already awake beside her, staring up at the intricate pattern of roots and branches above them. "I'm going to call Ed Calloway," he said without preamble. "Soon as we can get to a phone." Martha nodded, relief flooding through her that they'd arrived at the same conclusion. "We tell him everything. Let him guide us through this." "And we don't open that vault again," Roy added firmly. "Not until the authorities are present. We don't touch another thing. That way there's no question about our intentions." They were making plans, fortifying themselves with practical steps when they heard it, the sound that would change everything. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the frozen underbrush with purpose and speed. Martha's heart seized. Roy grabbed her hand, his face going pale. They'd been found. But by whom? "Don't move!" a voice called out, male, authoritative, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Federal agents! We need you to come out slowly with your hands visible." Federal agents. Martha's mind reeled. How did they know? How could they possibly know? Roy helped her crawl out of their shelter first, both of them moving stiffly after 2 nights on cold ground. As they emerged into the pale morning light, Martha counted 5 men in dark suits and overcoats, spread out in a semicircle around the oak tree. They had the look of law enforcement, fit, alert, hands resting near their hips where she assumed guns were holstered. The man in front, mid-50s with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, held up a badge. "Special Agent Frank Morrison, FBI. I need you both to step away from the tree and keep your hands where I can see them." They complied immediately, Martha's legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. Roy steadied her, his own hands trembling. This was it. They were about to be arrested for something they hadn't even decided to do yet. "Are you Martha and Roy Hayes?" Agent Morrison asked, consulting a small notebook. "Yes," Roy managed, his voice rough with fear. "How did you—" "GPS tracker in your cell phone, Mr. Hayes. When you made a call from this location yesterday morning, it pinged our monitoring system." Morrison's expression was unreadable. "This site has been under passive surveillance for 73 years. Any electronic activity within a half-mile radius triggers an automatic alert." Martha felt dizzy. 73 years? You've known about this place for 73 years? Known about it? Ma'am, we've been trying to find the exact location since 1952. Morrison stepped closer, his eyes moving to the oak tree, then to the disturbed earth at its base. The Holbrook Cache, one of the largest unsolved organized crime mysteries in American history. We knew it was somewhere in this region, but the original documentation was deliberately vague. The tree was mentioned in intercepted communications, but there are thousands of old oaks in these hills. Another agent, a younger woman with dark hair pulled back severely, spoke up. "When your phone pinged yesterday, we scrambled a team. Been watching through night vision since 1800 hours. Saw you go in and out of the vault twice. The world tilted. They'd been watched. All night, while they agonized over their decision, federal agents had been in the woods surrounding them." "We were going to call the authorities this morning," Martha said, her voice breaking. "I swear to God, we were about to turn it in. We didn't take anything. We didn't—" "Mrs. Hayes," Morrison interrupted, his voice gentler now. "Take a breath. We know you didn't take anything. We know you've been sleeping in that tree for 2 nights. We know you're homeless." He paused, something that might have been respect flickering in his eyes. "And we know that despite finding what is likely the largest treasure cache in American history, your first call yesterday morning was to a lawyer to ask what the right thing to do was." Roy's knees buckled. Martha caught him, or maybe he caught her. They held each other up while the weight of those words sank in. "You've been listening," Roy said hollowly, "to our conversations." "We have audio surveillance equipment set up around the perimeter," the female agent confirmed. "Standard protocol for a site this sensitive. We heard everything, your discovery, your debates, your decision to report it." She glanced at Morrison. "It's why we're approaching this as a recovery operation and not an arrest." Morrison nodded. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, I want to be very clear. You are not under arrest. You are not suspects. You are witnesses and, pending investigation, potential claimants under treasure trove law. But we need your full cooperation." Martha couldn't speak. The relief was so intense it hurt. Roy found his voice first. "What do you need from us?" "Everything," Morrison said simply. "Your story from the beginning, a complete inventory of what you found, statements, documentation, all of it. This is going to be a long process and it's going to get complicated, but if you're honest with us, and so far you have been, there's no reason this can't end well for everyone." Over the next 6 hours, Martha and Roy told their story again and again. To Morrison, to his team, to crime scene technicians who arrived to document the site, to archaeologists from the University of Tennessee who came to ensure the historical value was preserved, to accountants who began the massive task of inventorying the cache. The oak tree and the surrounding area were cordoned off with yellow tape. A mobile command center was established in the clearing. By noon, there were more than 20 federal personnel on site, and the quiet woods Martha and Roy had stumbled into had become something resembling a military operation. Ed Calloway arrived around 2 in the afternoon, brought by federal escort after Roy had been allowed one phone call. The old lawyer took one look at the scene, at his clients wrapped in FBI-issued blankets and sitting in the back of a heated van, and his face went hard. Have they been read their rights? Are they free to leave? Have they been coerced in any way? Ed, Martha said tiredly. It's okay. They're treating us fairly. Morrison approached, extending his hand. You must be Mr. Calloway. I'm Special Agent Morrison. Your clients have been nothing but cooperative. They're not under arrest, not being detained. They're free to leave whenever they want, though we'd appreciate their continued assistance. Ed shook his hand warily. And their legal status regarding the cash? That's going to be determined through the courts, Morrison said frankly. But I'll tell you what I told them. Their immediate reporting, their honesty, their lack of any attempt to conceal or profit from the discovery, all of that works heavily in their favor. How heavily? Morrison paused, seeming to measure his words. We've already spoken with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Given the circumstances and the age of the cash, they're not inclined to pursue criminal forfeiture of the entire amount. There will be claims, negotiations, but... He looked at Martha and Roy. You're not walking away from this empty-handed. That much I can tell you. Ed pulled them aside, spoke in low tones. This is good. This is much better than I expected. But Martha, Roy, you need to understand, the moment this goes public, and it will go public very soon, your lives are going to change in ways you can't imagine. There will be media, scrutiny, people coming out of the woodwork with claims and schemes. You're going to need protection, not just legal, but physical. We just want to do the right thing, Roy said, exhaustion making him sound decades older than he was. I know, Ed said gently. And that's exactly why you're going to come through this. But it's going to be a fight. The story broke that evening. Someone, a local resident who'd seen the federal convoy, or maybe a sheriff's deputy who'd been called to help secure the perimeter, tipped off a reporter. By nightfall, news vans were setting up in Maple Ridge's tiny downtown. By morning, the story had gone national. Elderly homeless couple discovers $260 million gangster fortune, screamed the headlines. Within 48 hours, Martha and Roy Hayes became the most famous people in America. The FBI moved them to a secure location, a small hotel in Knoxville, 40 miles from Maple Ridge, with 2 agents assigned to their protection. Ed had insisted on round-the-clock security, and for once the government hadn't argued. The cash was too valuable, the publicity too intense, the potential dangers too real. Their children arrived within days, flying in from 4 different states. Thomas, Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer gathered in the cramped hotel room, looking at their parents with expressions that mixed concern, pride, and barely concealed shock. You found $260 million, Thomas kept saying, as if repetition would make it real. Sleeping under a tree. You found $260 million. We don't have it, Martha reminded him gently. We found it. There's a difference. Sarah, always the practical one, wanted to know about lawyers, about their legal standing, about what the likely outcome was. Michael worried about their safety, about threats, about criminals who might come looking. And Jennifer, the youngest, just kept hugging them, crying, saying she'd been so scared when she heard they were homeless. Why hadn't they called? She would have sent money. She would have done something. We didn't want to burden you, Roy said quietly. You all have your own struggles. You're our parents, Jennifer said fiercely. You're never a burden. The legal battle began in earnest 2 weeks later. The government filed a claim for the entire cash, arguing it represented proceeds from criminal activity and therefore subject to federal seizure. Ed countered with a motion asserting treasure trove rights, arguing that the cache had been abandoned for 95 years and that Martha and Roy were entitled to the full value as finders. But they weren't the only claimants. Within a month, 17 different parties had filed suit seeking all or part of the fortune. 3 banks claimed money stolen from their vaults in the 1920s, providing serial numbers and theft reports to prove their cases. The state of Tennessee claimed rights based on the cache's location on state land. The families of several prohibition agents killed in the line of duty filed wrongful death claims. And most troubling of all, 3 different individuals came forward claiming to be descendants of Charles Holbrook and his associates, arguing the cache was their family inheritance. The Holbrook claimants were led by a man named Vincent Caruso, who claimed his grandmother had been Charles Holbrook's sister. He arrived at the first preliminary hearing with 2 lawyers, 3 bodyguards, and an attitude that made Martha's skin crawl. "That money belonged to my family," he announced to the gaggle of reporters outside the courthouse. "These people found it by accident. They have no right to it. It's been passed down in legend for generations. Hidden family assets that were meant to secure our future. We've been searching for it for 70 years. Your family were criminals," one reporter called out. "Why should you get money from illegal activities?" Caruso's smile was cold. Alleged criminals, never convicted, and family is family. You can't punish people for the sins of their grandparents. Inside the courthouse, Martha watched him take the witness stand during a preliminary hearing, watched him spin stories about his grandmother's tearful deathbed confession about hidden money, about family honor, about rightful inheritance. He was smooth, convincing, and absolutely terrifying. "He's dangerous," Agent Morrison told them during a recess. "Caruso's got connections to organized crime in New Jersey. Nothing we can prove in court, but he's not just some descendant looking for a payday. He's got backers, serious ones." "What does that mean for us?" Roy asked. Morrison's expression was grim. "It means you take the protection we're offering seriously. It means you don't go anywhere alone. And it means this case just got a lot more complicated." The media circus intensified. Every day brought new reporters, new angles, new invasions of privacy. They discovered Thomas's near foreclosure and ran stories about how the found fortune could save his family. They found out about Sarah's daughter's medical needs and questioned whether the Hayes family deserved the money more than crime victims. They tracked down former customers from Roy's garage and elderly patients Martha had cared for, all sharing stories about the Hayes' generosity and hard work. But there were negative stories too, opinion pieces questioning whether 2 elderly people could be trusted with such wealth, armchair lawyers arguing they should get nothing because they'd trespassed on state land, social media debates about whether finders keepers applied to stolen money and whether the money should go to charity instead. The scrutiny was suffocating. Martha and Roy couldn't leave their hotel without cameras in their faces, couldn't answer their phone without reporters on the line, couldn't even order room service without wondering if the server would sell their story to a tabloid. But something else happened too. The people of Maple Ridge rallied. It started small. A handful of locals showing up outside the courthouse during the first hearing, holding signs that read, "Martha and Roy deserve justice and support our neighbors." But it grew. Within weeks, there was an organized support campaign, a legal defense fund that collected small donations from thousands of people, a website telling their story. Sophie, the librarian, became their unofficial spokesperson. "These people are the best of us," she told a CNN reporter. "They spent their lives helping others. They lost everything through no fault of their own. And when they found a fortune, their first instinct was to report it and do the right thing. If that doesn't deserve reward, what does?" The town council passed a resolution supporting their claim. Local churches held prayer vigils. The shelter where they'd stayed organized a fundraiser to help with legal costs, the irony lost on no one. Homeless people taking up a collection to help people who might become multimillionaires. "Why are they doing this?" Martha asked Ed after a particularly moving ceremony where the elementary school students presented them with handmade cards. "Because you represent something people want to believe in," Ed said. "In a world where it feels like cheaters win and good people finish last, you're proof that honesty still matters. They're not just supporting you, they're supporting the idea that the system can work the way it's supposed to." The preliminary hearing stretched into months. Expert witnesses testified about treasure trove law, about the statute of limitations on criminal proceeds, about the historical value of the cash and the rights of finders. The government argued that no amount of time erased the criminal origin of the money. Ed argued that 95 years of abandonment created a new legal reality. The bank claims were the easiest to resolve. Serial numbers on some of the cash matched theft reports from 1926 and 1927. After negotiation, they settled for a combined total of $3.2 million. Less than they claimed, but more than they'd likely have won at trial. The victim families were harder. How do you put a price on a murdered grandfather? Ed worked out settlements with most of them, small amounts that acknowledged their pain without bankrupting the eventual award to Martha and Roy. But Vincent Caruso wouldn't negotiate. He wanted everything, and he was willing to fight for it. The threats started in month 4. A note slipped under their hotel room door. "You're stealing from the wrong family." A brick through Ed's office window with a message tied to it. "Drop the case." Anonymous calls to their children's homes, heavy breathing, click, disconnect. The FBI took it seriously, upgrading their security, running traces on the threats, investigating Caruso's associates. But they couldn't prove anything concrete, couldn't tie the threats directly to him or his people. "He's trying to scare you into settling," Morrison said, "giving up your claim in exchange for your safety." "Is it working?" Roy asked Martha that night, lying in their hotel bed, listening to the sounds of traffic outside. Martha thought about it honestly. Was she scared? Absolutely. Did she jump at unexpected sounds? Yes. Did she worry about their children, about what their claim might cost them? Every single day. But she also thought about the warming shelter, about the other elderly people she'd seen there, about the indignity and fear of having nowhere to go. She thought about all the medical bills drowning good people, about the foreclosures destroying families, about a system that seemed designed to grind down anyone who wasn't already wealthy. "No," she said firmly. "It's not working. We found that money honestly. We reported it honestly. And we deserve our fair share, not because we're greedy, but because that's what the law says. We're not backing down." Roy pulled her close. "That's my girl." The trial finally began in month 7, Federal District Court, Eastern District of Tennessee. Judge Sarah Whitmore presiding, a stern woman in her 60s known for her no-nonsense approach and her intolerance for media circuses. She'd banned cameras from the courtroom and limited public seating, creating an oasis of relative calm in the storm of publicity. The government presented its case first. The money was proceeds from criminal activity, prohibition violations, theft, racketeering. Even 95 years later, even with most of the perpetrators long dead, the origin tainted everything. They wanted 60% of the total value, with the remainder divided among legitimate claimants and possibly a finder's fee for Martha and Roy. Ed countered with treasure trove precedent going back centuries. Abandoned property, legally unclaimed for nearly a century, found by honest citizens on public land. Under established law, finders were entitled to the full value minus any legitimate claims by original owners or their direct heirs. "And that's the key question, Your Honor," Ed argued during his opening statement. "Who are the legitimate heirs? The government, which never owned this property? Banks, whose claims are 95 years old and partially time-barred? Or the descendants of criminals who want to profit from their ancestors' crimes?" Vincent Caruso's lawyers argued family inheritance rights, claiming the cash was intentionally hidden to preserve family wealth across generations. They presented documents, some genuine, some of questionable authenticity, suggesting Charles Holbrook had intended his estate to pass to his sister's children. "Your Honor," his lead attorney argued, "my client's grandmother spent her entire life believing her brother had left her security. This money was meant for family. The Hayeses are strangers with no connection to the property or its history. They simply got lucky." The trial became a referendum on American values. What we owe to crime victims, what finders deserve, what family means, whether the origin of money ever fully washes away. Witnesses testified on all sides. Historians detailed Prohibition-era crimes. Economists calculated modern value with and without interest. Ethicists debated moral claims versus legal rights. And through it all, Martha and Roy sat at the defense table, their hands clasped together, looking smaller and more fragile with each passing day. The stress was taking its toll. Roy's chest pains had returned, requiring new medication. Martha's blood sugar was erratic despite regular insulin. They'd aged years in months. "Is it worth it?" Sarah asked her mother during a recess in week 3. "Your health, the stress, the threats? Is any amount of money worth this?" Martha looked at her daughter, at the worry lines creasing her young face, and felt the weight of generational struggle. Sarah was 46, working 2 jobs, raising 3 kids, her husband's income barely covering the mortgage. She was living the same life Martha had lived, the same paycheck-to-paycheck existence with no safety net, no cushion, no hope of anything better. "Yes," Martha said quietly. "Because this isn't just about money. It's about whether the system rewards honesty or punishes it. It's about whether doing the right thing matters. And Sarah, if we walk away from this, if we let fear or exhaustion or powerful people intimidate us into giving up what we're legally entitled to, what does that teach you? What does that teach your kids?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "It teaches us that the deck is always stacked against people like us." "Exactly," Martha said. "So we fight, not because we're brave, but because someone has to." The trial entered its 6th week when Judge Whitmore finally called for closing arguments. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, reporters standing along the back wall, sketch artists capturing every moment for the news programs waiting outside. Ed stood slowly, looking every one of his 81 years, but his voice was strong. "Your Honor, this case is simple. 2 elderly people, homeless and forgotten, found abandoned property while seeking shelter from a storm. They didn't hide it. They didn't steal it. They didn't try to profit before reporting it. They did exactly what the law requires. They came forward immediately and honestly. The government wants to punish them for that honesty by limiting their claim. Mr. Caruso wants to profit from his grandfather's crimes. The banks want to relitigate losses from 95 years ago. But the law is clear. Finders of abandoned property have rights, strong rights. Rights that don't disappear just because the property was once stolen or because powerful interests would prefer a different outcome. Martha and Roy Hayes are not criminals. They're not con artists. They're just 2 people who got lucky and then did the right thing. If we don't reward that, if we don't protect that, we're telling every American that honesty is for suckers, that doing the right thing makes you a target, that the system exists to serve the powerful, not the just. Your Honor, I'm asking you to rule according to the law, not public pressure or political convenience. And the law says these good people deserve their find." The government attorney argued next, emphasizing the criminal origins, the public interest, the need to discourage treasure hunting on public lands. Then Caruso's lawyer made his case for family rights and inherited property. Finally, Judge Whitmore spoke. "I'll take this under advisement. You'll have my ruling within 30 days. Court is adjourned." And with that, all they could do was wait. The 30 days felt like 30 years. Martha and Roy remained in protective custody, though the FBI had moved them to a small furnished apartment in Knoxville that felt slightly more like home than the hotel. Ed visited daily with updates that were really non-updates. The judge was deliberating. The media was speculating. Various parties were positioning for potential appeals. Roy's chest pains worsened in week 2. Martha found him one morning clutching his arm, his face gray, sweat beading on his forehead. The ambulance ride to the hospital felt like a descent into nightmare. What if he died before they knew the outcome? What if all of this stress, all of this fighting killed him before they ever saw a dollar? The doctors kept him for 3 days, adjusting his medications, running tests, lecturing him about stress management, as if he had any control over the pressure crushing down on them. When Martha sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand, listening to the monitors beep his struggling heartbeat, she wondered if Ed had been right to fight so hard. Maybe they should have settled early, taken whatever scraps were offered, chosen peace over principle. "Stop it," Roy said weakly, reading her thoughts the way he'd been reading them for 54 years. "We didn't come this far to give up now." "But what if—" "No what ifs," he interrupted gently. "We did the right thing. Whatever happens now, we can live with it because we know we were honest. That's worth more than any amount of money." Martha wanted to believe him, but sitting in that sterile hospital room watching machines breathe life into her husband, she felt the weight of every choice that had led them here. The choice to shelter under that tree, the choice to investigate the metal surface, the choice to report what they'd found. Each one had seemed so clear in the moment, but now, with Roy's life hanging in the balance, she wondered if clarity and wisdom were the same thing. He came home on day 26. 4 days later, Ed called. "The judge has issued her ruling. She wants to read it in open court tomorrow at 10. I need you both there." The courtroom was even more packed than during trial, if that was possible. Every seat filled, people standing 3 deep at the back, reporters crammed into the media section like sardines. Martha and Roy sat at the defense table, Roy still pale from his hospital stay, Martha's hands trembling so badly she had to clasp them in her lap to hide it. Their children sat in the front row behind them. Thomas, Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer, all of them having flown back to Knoxville for the ruling. Ed sat beside Martha and Roy, his weathered face betraying nothing, but his hand shook slightly as he organized papers he didn't need to organize. Judge Whitmore entered, and everyone rose. She looked stern as ever, her face revealing nothing as she settled into her chair and adjusted her reading glasses. The bailiff called the court to order, and silence fell like a physical weight. "I've given this case considerable thought," Judge Whitmore began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "The legal issues are complex, but the human element is impossible to ignore. We have 2 elderly citizens who found themselves homeless through no moral failing. Medical debt and economic collapse destroyed what they'd spent a lifetime building. We have a discovery that, by any measure, was handled with remarkable honesty. And we have competing claims from various parties, some more sympathetic than others." She paused, looking directly at Martha and Roy. "The question before this court is not just about legal precedent. It's about what we value as a society. Do we reward honesty? Do we punish vulnerability? Do we allow criminal origins to taint property in perpetuity, or does time and abandonment create a clean slate?" Martha's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "After reviewing all evidence and arguments, I make the following rulings," Judge Whitmore continued. "First, regarding the government's claim of criminal forfeiture. While I acknowledge the cash originated from criminal activity, I find that 95 years of abandonment combined with the death of all original perpetrators and the absence of any ongoing criminal enterprise severs the legal connection between the current property and its illegal origins. The government's claim is denied." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ed's hand found Martha's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Second, regarding the claims of various banks. I find that 3 institutions have provided sufficient documentation of theft and serial number matches to support partial restitution. However, given the passage of time and the good faith of the finders, I'm limiting these claims to face value of the documented stolen bills without interest. Total, $3.2 million. More murmurs. The bank attorneys were conferring rapidly. Third, regarding the claims of victim families, while I'm deeply sympathetic to those who lost loved ones to Prohibition-era violence, I find insufficient legal basis to award damages from property whose connection to specific crimes cannot be definitively established. However, I'm creating a victim compensation fund of $5 million from the total cash to be distributed among documented families of Prohibition enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. Even in ruling against them, the judge had found a way to acknowledge their pain. Fourth, and most significantly regarding Vincent Caruso and other alleged descendants of Charles Holbrook and his associates. Judge Whitmore's voice hardened. I find the claims to be without merit. The cash was deliberately hidden to evade federal authorities. There is no evidence of any intent to pass this property to heirs. Moreover, allowing criminal descendants to profit from their ancestors' crimes would violate fundamental public policy. These claims are denied in their entirety. The courtroom erupted. Caruso's attorneys were on their feet objecting. Reporters were whispering frantically into phones. The bailiff called for order, his voice barely cutting through the noise. Judge Whitmore slammed her gavel. Order! I will have order in this courtroom or I will clear it. Silence fell again, tense and electric. Finally, regarding Martha and Roy Hayes. The judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Under treasure trove law, as established by centuries of precedent, these individuals are entitled to the full value of abandoned property found on public land. They acted with immediate honesty. They cooperated fully with authorities, and they made no attempt to conceal or profit before proper legal review. However, this court must also balance their rights against competing claims and public interest. Martha stopped breathing. Therefore, I rule as follows. From the total estimated value of $260 million, the following deductions will be made. $3.2 million to documented bank claims, $5 million to the Victim Compensation Fund, $20 million to the State of Tennessee for historical preservation and to fund future archaeological and recovery efforts on public lands, $15 million to the federal government for investigation costs, preservation, and cataloging. That leaves a net amount of $216.8 million. The numbers seem to hang in the air, impossible and real at the same time. Of this remaining amount, I award Martha and Roy Hayes $45 million as their finder's fee, representing 20% of the net value after legitimate claims. This amount reflects their rights under treasure trove law, while acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the find and competing public interests. The remaining $171.8 million will be held in federal trust to be used for crime victim compensation programs, historical preservation, and public benefit as determined by federal administrators. The gavel came down with finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits. Lawyers shouted about appeals. Caruso's face was purple with rage as he argued with his attorneys, and Martha and Roy sat frozen, unable to process what they'd just heard. $45 million. They'd won. Not everything, but enough. More than enough. More than they'd ever dreamed possible in those cold nights under the oak tree. Ed turned to them, tears streaming down his weathered face. You did it. My God, you actually did it. Their children surged forward, surrounding them, everyone crying and laughing and talking at once. Thomas kept saying, 45 million, 45 million, like a mantra. Sarah was sobbing into Michael's shoulder. Jennifer had her arms around both her parents, squeezing so tight Martha could barely breathe. Agent Morrison pushed through the crowd, a rare smile on his usually stern face. Congratulations. Honestly, I didn't think the judge would go that high. She could have capped it at 10 or 15%. 45 million. That's a clear statement about the value of honesty. Will Caruso appeal? Roy asked, his voice shaky. Probably, but he won't win. The judge's reasoning is solid and his claim was always weak. He might drag it out a few more months, but this ruling will stand. Morrison extended his hand. You're going to be all right now. Both of you. The money didn't arrive all at once. There were procedures, paperwork, appeals to resolve, accounts to establish. Ed worked with a financial advisor he trusted, a woman named Grace Chen, who specialized in helping lottery winners and inheritance recipients manage sudden wealth. Wait, I can't use the last name Chen. Let me fix that. Ed worked with a financial advisor he trusted, a woman named Grace Miller who specialized in helping lottery winners and inheritance recipients manage sudden wealth. The first thing we do, Grace told them during their initial meeting, is make sure you're protected. Trusts, LLC structures, privacy protections. The second thing is we make sure you're secure, enough set aside to cover your needs for the rest of your lives, medical care, housing, everything. Then, and only then, we talk about what you want to do with the rest. The rest turned out to be approximately $32 million after taxes, trusts, and setting aside enough for their lifetime security. It was still an impossible amount, still more money than their entire family had earned in 3 generations. What do we do with it? Martha asked Roy one night, sitting in the small house they'd purchased in Maple Ridge. Nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom ranch with a front porch and a yard. Their first real home in over a year. Roy was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkness beyond their window. Finally, he said, "We do what we talked about that night under the tree. We help people." The first purchase was the land. All 20 acres surrounding the ancient oak tree, bought from the state for $250,000. They placed it in a conservation trust, ensuring it would never be developed, never be destroyed. The oak that had sheltered them would shelter the land forever. But they didn't just protect it, they transformed it. Working with local contractors, they built a small visitor center near the road, far enough from the tree to preserve its sanctity, but close enough to tell its story. Inside, displays chronicled not just the discovery of the cache, but the broader history of the area, Prohibition-era Tennessee, and the importance of protecting natural landmarks. And at the heart of the property they created something more meaningful, a shelter. Not like the cold, institutional shelter where they'd spent those desperate nights. This was different. This was what a shelter should be. Small private rooms instead of dormitories, each with a real bed, a reading lamp, a lock on the door. A commercial kitchen where residents could cook their own meals or join community dinners. A medical clinic staffed 3 days a week by volunteer doctors and nurses. A computer lab for job searches and resume writing. Washing machines and dryers because dignity requires clean clothes. They called it Oak Haven, and they built it to hold 40 people, individuals and families. The rules were simple. No violence, no drugs or alcohol on premises, and everyone contributed somehow, cooking, cleaning, helping maintain the grounds. But there were no mandatory religion, no curfews for adults, no arbitrary restrictions, just safety, warmth, and the space to rebuild. "Why 40?" the architect had asked when they were planning. "Because that's how many people were in the shelter the night we couldn't face going back," Martha had answered. 40 people who needed somewhere to go. We want to make sure there's always room. Oak Haven opened 14 months after the court ruling on a crisp October morning. The mayor of Maple Ridge was there, along with Sophie the librarian, Ed Calloway, Agent Morrison, and dozens of people from town. But the guests of honor were the first residents, 12 individuals and 3 families who moved in that day, carrying everything they owned in garbage bags and worn suitcases, looking at the clean rooms and real beds like they'd stumbled into a dream. Martha and Roy greeted each one personally, shaking hands, learning names, making sure everyone felt welcomed. And when an elderly man, maybe 70, with shaking hands and tears in his eyes, said, "I ain't slept in a real bed in 6 months," Martha hugged him and whispered, "You're home now. You're safe." But Oak Haven was just the beginning. They funded a sliding-scale medical clinic in downtown Maple Ridge where anyone could receive care regardless of ability to pay. Roy insisted it include dental and vision services, because bad teeth and no glasses shouldn't keep someone from getting a job. They established a scholarship fund for local high school students, full rides to trade schools or community colleges, with preference given to kids from low-income families. The first year, they funded 15 students. The second year, 23. They renovated the old community center that had been condemned for safety issues, turning it into a hub for after-school programs, senior activities, job training workshops, and community meals. The renovated building was named Maple Ridge Community Hall, but everyone called it the Hayes Place. They bought the abandoned factory building, the same one that had stood dark and empty as a monument to the town's economic collapse, and donated it to a nonprofit that converted it into 60 units of affordable housing. Families who'd been priced out of the rental market suddenly had clean, safe homes with reasonable rents and supportive services. And they did it all quietly, without press releases or ribbon cuttings unless absolutely necessary. They showed up to volunteer at the shelter, to serve meals at the community center, to tutor kids in the scholarship program. They lived modestly in their small ranch house, drove a sensible sedan, and wore clothes from the same stores they'd always shopped at. "Why don't you enjoy it more?" Sarah asked her mother one day, watching Martha sort donated clothes at Oak Haven. "You have tens of millions of dollars. You could travel, buy nice things, actually live like wealthy people." Martha looked at her daughter with an expression that was both gentle and firm. "Baby, we are enjoying it. Every person who gets a warm bed, every kid who goes to college, every family that doesn't lose their home, that's our enjoyment. That's our legacy. We didn't earn this money, Sarah. We found it. The only way to deserve keeping any of it is to share it." But that didn't mean they ignored their family. They paid off Thomas's mortgage, giving him the security he'd been struggling to maintain. They funded Sarah's daughter's medical treatments and her braces. They helped Michael buy a reliable car and start a small business. They set up trust funds for their grandchildren's education. They made sure their children would never face the desperation that had nearly destroyed them. "We take care of our own," Roy explained to his sons, "but we don't forget that there are a lot of families out there without anyone to help them. We're just trying to be that someone." The town of Maple Ridge began to change. New businesses opened, drawn by the revitalized downtown and the skilled workers graduating from trade school programs. The population, which had been declining for 20 years, stabilized and then began to grow. Property values increased, but the affordable housing prevented displacement. Employment rose, high school graduation rates improved. Economists studying the phenomenon called it the Hayes effect. What happens when significant wealth is injected into a struggling community through targeted, thoughtful philanthropy rather than top-down economic development programs. But for Martha and Roy, it wasn't an economic theory. It was just doing what felt right. The oak tree became something more than a tree. The Forest Service designated it a protected landmark, ensuring its preservation. People began visiting, first locals, then tourists from around the state, eventually from across the country. They came to see where the miracle had happened, where two elderly people had found shelter and fortune in the same moment. The Visitors Center displayed the story carefully, respectfully. Photos of Martha and Roy from before, Roy in his mechanic's garage, Martha caring for her patients. Documentation of their struggles. Then the discovery, told with all its drama and uncertainty, the legal battle, the ruling, and most importantly, what came after, how they'd chosen to use their windfall not for themselves but for their community. "Why do people care so much?" Roy asked Morrison during one of the FBI agents' occasional visits. They'd become friends over the months of investigation and trial. an unlikely bond forged in unusual circumstances. Because your story gives people hope, Morrison said simply. In a world that feels rigged against ordinary people, you proved that honesty still matters, that doing the right thing can actually work out, that the system, occasionally, rewards the good guys. He smiled. You're not just a feel-good story, Roy. You're proof that America can still live up to its ideals. 3 years after the discovery, Martha and Roy stood beneath the oak tree on a February morning, the anniversary of that desperate night when they'd sought shelter from a storm. The tree looked the same, ancient and unmoved by the passage of time, its massive roots still creating that hollow space where they'd huddled together in fear and cold. Hard to believe it was only 3 years ago, Martha said softly, her hand in Roy's, both of them warmer now in their good winter coats, both of them healthy with proper medical care and medication they could afford. Feels like another lifetime, Roy agreed, like it happened to different people. We are different people, Martha said, aren't we? Or are we the same, just with different circumstances? Roy considered this, looking up at the massive tree, at the branches reaching toward a gray winter sky. I think we're the same people we always were. We just finally got a chance to be that fully, to help people the way we always wanted to, but never could. They walked back toward Oak Haven, where the residents were preparing for a community breakfast. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the windows they could see people moving, talking, living. Since opening, Oak Haven had sheltered 197 people. 143 had transitioned into permanent housing. 72 had found stable employment. 11 had gone to college. 3 had started their own businesses. But Martha's favorite success story was Eleanor, a woman who'd arrived at 79 years old, evicted from her apartment, surviving on Social Security that didn't cover rent and food. She'd been so ashamed, so certain her life was over. But at Oak Haven, she'd found not just shelter but community. She now volunteered at the community center, teaching quilting to anyone who wanted to learn, her laugh echoing through the halls as she worked. That could have been us, Martha said, watching Eleanor through the window, surrounded by students learning to stitch. If we hadn't found that tree, if we hadn't gotten lucky, that could have been us dying alone and forgotten. It was us, Roy corrected gently. For a little while, it was us. That's why we understand. That's why we can help. Inside, they joined the breakfast, Roy helping to cook while Martha set tables, both of them working alongside residents who were finding their feet again. And as they worked, Martha found herself thinking about that note they'd found in the vault, the words written by a long-dead criminal. Use it better than we did. They'd tried. God knows they'd tried. The money that had been stolen, hidden, abandoned, they'd transformed it into something that healed rather than harmed. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly and with love. The shelter that had saved them had become the means to shelter others. The tree that had protected them for one desperate night now stood as a symbol of hope for everyone who needed reminding that miracles could come from the strangest places, that the lowest points could become the foundation for something beautiful. We did it, Roy said quietly, echoing her thoughts as he so often did. We took something dark and made it light. Martha leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun break through the winter clouds, casting golden light across the room full of people eating and laughing and planning their futures. Not we, she corrected. All of us, every person in this room, every person who donated to the legal fund, every volunteer who gives their time, we're all doing it together. That's the real treasure, Roy said. Not what we found, but what we built. Years later, when historians and journalists would write about the Holbrook cache and its discovery, they would focus on the money. $260 million, one of the largest treasure finds in American history. They would detail the legal battle, the competing claims, the dramatic courthouse victory. But for the people of Maple Ridge, the real story was simpler and more profound. Two elderly people, forgotten by the world, had been given a second chance, and instead of hoarding that chance, they'd multiplied it, sharing it with everyone who needed hope, help, and a reminder that goodness still existed in the world. The oak tree still stands, older now by a few years but essentially unchanged, its roots reaching deep into Tennessee soil, its branches reaching high into Tennessee sky. And in the hollow where Martha and Roy once huddled against a winter storm, visitors leave small tokens, coins, notes, prayers, symbols of their own hopes and struggles. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones we find buried in the earth. Sometimes they're the ones we create when we choose compassion over greed, community over selfishness, and sharing over hoarding. Anyone can stumble upon fortune if they're lucky enough. But it takes character, real, tested, proven character, to use that fortune to lift others rather than just yourself. Martha and Roy Hayes had that character before they found the money. The money just gave them the opportunity to prove it. As Martha once told a reporter who asked if finding the cash had changed her life, "It changed our circumstances, but it didn't change who we are. We're still the same people who believed in helping neighbors, in doing right even when it's hard, in leaving the world better than we found it. We just finally got the resources to do it on a bigger scale." And Roy, standing beside her, had added, "We were given a miracle when we needed it most. Now we spend every day trying to pass it forward, because that's what miracles are for, not to keep, but to share." The end. Up next, two more powerful stories about everyday people who changed the world through simple acts of courage and compassion. Click to keep discovering these incredible journeys, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that doing the right thing still matters, even when no one is watching.